Okay, it's time to get rolling with the webinar for today. Welcome to One Critical Factor for UI Test Automation Success. This is hosted by Telerik. However, your hosts for today, on this slide here, myself and Jim Evans, neither of us actually work for Telerik. Telerik was gracious enough to let us join in here and talk about some stuff that we happen to think is really important. I'm Jim Holmes. I'm the VP of ALM and testing at Falafel Software. You can see my Twitter handle up there. I'm joined today by my good pal Jim Evans, and he's a QA dev at Salesforce. But where I've known him from is his tremendous contributions to Selenium WebDriver. Jim, do you want to go ahead and chat about that for a moment or two?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I've been working with the Selenium project and contributing to the WebDriver portion of the Selenium project for about 4 years now, and I've been working at Salesforce for a little less than 3.
Great. Okay, thanks. And so for the attendees today, this is a short webinar. We're going to only go through about half an hour of things. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. There's two of us. I'll try to keep tabs on what's going on in the Q&A window as we're going along, but we'll try to catch up with everything towards the end for sure. But here's the whole point of today's discussion. And this is trying to help you if you're struggling or if you're looking at getting into UI test automation. And let's be clear, so Telerik's hosting this, but this is not about Telerik Test Studio. If you've got questions about Test Studio, we can certainly route you toward the right people. But this is actually kind of even more about the meta, about the higher level things. Why do test projects, UI test automation projects fail? I've been in this game for a long time, as has Jim Evans. First off, the domain is hard. UI automation is just tough. You're at the business level, and that's always complex. The technology is hard. If you're working with Adobe Flash, or you're doing Java Swing, or you're on mobile, or you're on web or Windows desktop or some other technology, it's just the technology's hard. You've got complex things about the UIs, trying to find objects on the screens. Asynchronous gives everybody fits, trying to deal with determining how to wait and pause and timing issues. And then finally, there's human nature 101. The hardest part of any software project, not just test automation, but software, is communication in general between humans. But there are a number of things that you can do to really help. And I think one of the biggest things, and this is why we're here, is developer involvement. I'm a passionate advocate of whole team testing, but I think it's critical to get developers dug in as part of this. And you attendees may have gotten here by reading Telerik's survey report that they did on critical success factors. And what the survey report really highlighted out are that the involvement of developers on any UI test automation project is really critical to some success. And they've got great metrics there. And again, Telerik being the awesome folks that they are, and by the way, I want to be clear, I worked for them for 3 years on Telerik Test Studio. I've moved on, but I still love the company and I love the tool. It's not all about just Test Studio. This is tremendous general high-level stuff. So we'll talk about some specifics today. And Jim and I have a number of talking points that we'll bounce around. We'll try to catch some things through the Q&A window. But Jim, the first point that I wanted to kick off on was something you and I've chatted about before, Testable UI. Having developers being able to do things like give good locators and just help out with the general UI structure overall, I think, is a huge piece of good success. What are your thoughts around testable UI?
Well, absolutely, Jim. I have worked on projects that are both web-based and that are sort of desktop client or desktop executable based. And in both cases, being able to being able to accurately locate the elements that you're wanting to interact with, and to have those locators remain stable among different builds of the product, because of course you're not going to just build it once. There are going to be bug fixes, and you're going to have to go back and redo some of the work or some of the same tests. It's critical that you be able to have those locators available and that they be stable. Um, and I can remember one desktop application that I was working on that we started to do an automated test suite for it, but it was a legacy application that didn't have any sort of real thought to making it automatable. And we got lucky when there was a ground up rewrite of that application, that we were able to loop in the developers and sort of make the case that, if we want to do automated testing, we need to be able uh, to really identify the elements on the screen and to automate the product. So that's one thing, one example from my experience.
It, we're talking developer tester collaboration, and um, it, every segment of teams, kind of throughout development history, it tends to get a little stovepiped, and you get the us and them mentality. And I've certainly been guilty of that myself. Um, what I've also found key to that, not key, but a key benefit rather of that collaboration and honest, open discussion there is I ended up learning a bunch about the system itself by needling developers about trying to make testable UI. For example, in my background, I had a legacy application. It was an ASP.NET web forms app, and it was a huge platform, and it had been around for quite some time. And I was trying to write WebDriver tests against it, and the locators were just miserable. I was ending up having to use a lot of really brittle, difficult um, XPath, for example, to get good locators. And I started working with the lead developer who owned the UI and had been there since day one of this like 7-year-old project. And I kept complaining, why can't you get IDs on this? Help me out with IDs on that. And it was very kind of self-centered, and I was being whiny. And through the discussions, I learned that there were some places where he absolutely could help, but I also found that there were spots where, because of various technological reasons, he couldn't do things like give me a stable ID on things. Um, and for example, it was a widget-based interface, and he couldn't simply slap static IDs on all the widgets, because if somebody put two of the same widget on the same page, now you've got broken HTML. And that was a big benefit, and frankly, a good learning experience for me that kind of got me out of that self-centered mode, and ended up actually solving a lot of problems because of those discussions. So we couldn't do static IDs here, but we could do some other things. And at the end, he started doing more of that at the start, even without me having to nag him about it. And I had a better understanding of what was going on as well.
Yeah, I have a similar story, where another application, a web-based application that I was working on doing an automated test suite for, that was using a JavaScript widget framework that had IDs on every element, but they were all dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And you could not easily make them static given the way that we were using the widget framework.
Right.
But one of the things we compromised on was we added after talking to the developer and making them aware of this particular challenge, we came to a compromise where, instead of insisting on an ID, they would add me a custom CSS class value, for
Ah,
example,
it,
which was unique, and it wasn't actually used for styling necessarily, but
sure.
it was something that we could actually hang our hat on, that we know that order ID number one will have order ID one in the CSS class somewhere, and we could look for it that way.
You know that that's just so critical. And actually, let me go on a quick tangent here for attendees who aren't familiar with what locators are for UI automation. It's how you find the thing on the UI that you're looking for. So, for example, an input field or a row in a data table, and the locator mechanism varies from tool set to tool set, and it varies from platform to platform. If you're on web, then HTML IDs are by far the best thing to generally use if they're not dynamically generated. So when Jim Evans and I are chatting about locators, that's what we mean. It's the mechanics on that particular platform for how your tool set finds stuff. And it's the if you can't get good locators, that's the biggest headache. So when we're talking about testable UI, the stories that Jim and I have been relating are um, these are the primary things. This is the first hurdle you've got to get up and over before you move on. There's also, Jim, I think something really nice to cover is test first approach. And I say test first, that's a very general term.
Hmm.
Depending on who you talk to, at the developer level, there's things like test driven development, behavioral driven development. You come up to the UI level, and people are using tools like Fitness,
Yep.
um, and other things to kind of build out UI tests even before the system's built. And
Yes.
if you're working with developers and you've got a good tool, you can actually start to scaffold out those tests right as the development work is starting, which is tremendous. You know, so many times in the test world, testing it's at the end of the train, which is just horrible. And the things get
Right.
built, it gets thrown over the fence. I'm a
And
huge
inevitably,
yeah.
the development takes longer than it was budgeted for, and what gets and yet somehow the release date doesn't move. So what gets squeezed out is the testing
Is
effort.
the testing absolutely so? Another key thing about developer tester collaboration, team involvement is being able to try to get even just the general discussions up front. Like we talked about locators, right? You know, things you can discuss with the team about what's the page going to look like. I'll need IDs here. What's been your experience around that, Jim?
Well, there are some things, even more than just having a good solid locator strategy. That's one thing that you can certainly sort of map out before any coding necessarily starts. But you can also start to think of things like, in particular, there's a lot of rich UI stuff that people like to do for applications that designers like to put in with dragging and dropping, sort of to make things feel kind of more natural to the end user, that can be really challenging to automate those kinds of gestures, because
Right.
they depend on specific drop points on the screen or on the page, or something like that. And by engaging and planning for this up front, you can sometimes sort of build in uh, um, additional mechanisms to attain the same thing, like perhaps a keyboard mechanism for doing the same drag and drop operation, something that's equivalent, that while, yes, you want to test and make sure that the actual drag and drop thing does what it's supposed to do, you can also you can separate out the wiring up of the mouse stuff from the testing of the actual functionality of the application. So that's another thing that can be sort of helped out by planning and doing testing first. You can
Yeah.
sort of separate out the content or the functionality testing from the UI manipulation testing, I would say.
Oh, good way to phrase that. Yeah. Yep. Um, so the importance of that communication about what can we do to make the UI as easily testable, doing that early is a huge thing because then you don't have to try to retrofit the UI because you're never going to have time for that, frankly, right?
Right.
Um, versus trying to spend a lot of extra time dealing with that complexity after everything's baked up and done.
I also remember one project that I was working on where we had some real great success. Um, Maybe not writing out specific automated tests, but at least being able to plan for them because we had wireframes up front of what the UI was supposed to look like. It wouldn't be. We had a separate design team that was designing the user experience,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to get the wireframes of what the UI was supposed to look like, at least in a general sense, maybe not with all the correct styling, but at least in the general sense, and understanding what the behaviors of that UI should be up front was something that was really useful in helping to plan out the test effort.
That's a really good point. Even if you haven't gotten to the point of negotiating around what those locators are going to be or what async is going to be there, you can still scaffold out your general behavior and have those discussions as that design work's being done. Um, and that's conversations, right? You and I both love those early conversations because we've personally seen the train wrecks that happen when you don't get that. So,
Exactly.
yeah. Okay. So I think we've kind of beat that one around well enough. I'd like to move on to something else that is a passion of mine. And that is, if I can get my mouse working right, um, backing APIs and infrastructure. So this
Oh,
means
fun.
different. I'm sorry, what's that, Jim?
I said, oh, fun. I love this topic. This is
Well,
great.
but it is to me. This is huge. So everybody's got different terminology or vernacular. When I say backing APIs or infrastructure, I'm talking about things that you can build up to leverage your own system rather than having to write a bunch of extra test code. So for me, the big thing is um, even if you start out using your UI tests for data setup or system configuration, as soon as possible, you should move that over to some form of a library call that's hitting the system itself. So, for example, when you're doing an update test, I shouldn't use the API to go hit the web admin page and build a record or a new customer to go update the customer. Instead, I'd rather use the system's own web service endpoints, or an internal API, or even hitting to a stored procedure, because that UI part is going to be slow and it's brittle. So minimizing that, but building up this infrastructure. Every time I've done this, my tests are more stable, they're dramatically faster, and I'm able to write more high value tests in a much speedier fashion. Thoughts, Jim?
I completely agree. I can't. One of the other approaches that I've seen taken that I've had some success with is and it goes along with this. I would vastly prefer doing my tests through the APIs of the system rather than going through the UI. There's a concept of a test pyramid,
Yep.
right? Where when you have a bunch of automated tests, the UI full stack automated test end-to-end tests are at the very top of the pyramid, the very smallest number of tests that should
Yep.
be in your system. Um, and when you go through when you go through and almost all test cases at some level have to have some data populated into the system to be meaningful. And if you're going through the UI to set up all that data, not only is it fragile, but almost inevitably it's going to be slower than going through
Absolutely.
a back-end API. and I'm all about getting better results faster,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
That's sort of the argument for being able to expose the API, the data access API, if you will,
Yep.
is that not only is it going to be more reliable in terms of getting my environment um, in the state that I need it to be in for my test, but it also is going to give me the results that I need to give you the feedback on your code faster.
Right.
That's another thing. Now another sort of similar approach that kind of builds on this is that instead of having the test enumerate the steps in the test itself, I have a library call in my test code, or a function call, a method call, in my own test code that does the operation for me. So for example, I'll give you an example. Say a customer editing application. Suppose I need to set up the customer in the database before I can go and edit it and make sure the edits are persisted properly.
Right.
So one approach could be that I could have my test create the customer and then go back and edit through the UI. Well, one thing that I might be able to do is create a method that's called add customer in my test library, in my own test code, that may start out by going through the UI to create the customer. But then later on, when I get the API exposed to go through the data access layer, I can swap that out and use the data access layer just to create the customer without actually changing the actual test case. So it keeps my test case maintainable.
Well, that's funny. So we didn't even discuss this ahead of time, but you actually just provided an awesome segue into the next topic, which is well-structured tests. I've been hollering about this for a long time, and I'm certainly not the only person, but you have to treat your test code like production code because it is. And good developers understand the concepts of abstraction and avoiding duplication and repetition. And what you just pointed out there, what you described, having that helper method, that's basic abstraction right there. So
absolutely,
you've got your test, it comes in, it hits that method. The test itself doesn't know a thing about how that customer got created, right? You built that helper method, and the helper method knows how to do that. And the test doesn't care that when it first starts out, that helper method uses the UI to build things. And then as you move on, you abstract that out to a web service or an internal API. Developers can help you get a well-structured suite of tests that are helpful for those kinds of tweaks, and that's tremendous.
And if you can, and if you have the kind of organization that engages in code reviews, and if you can get your developers to sit in on reviews of your test code,
yeah,
that's a phenomenal, that's an eye opener right there. A lot of times, just being able to get people who are entirely unfamiliar, and it goes both ways too. If you're a tester who understands code and you can sit in on some developer code reviews as well, that can be an eye-opening experience also. But just in terms of getting different sets of eyes with different that carry different baggage in on the code reviews can be really helpful in terms of both keeping your code structured well and making sure that you don't that you can help to avoid some of the silly errors that we all make when we're writing code.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think there's a good, healthy discussion of how technical. No, I was going to say how technical should testers be? Good testers are technical. How much development chops should testers have? And I tell people I tell testers who I'm getting introduced to test automation. Many of them get intimidated by, oh my God, I have to write code, or even if you're using something like Test Studio or other similar tools that give you a GUI to work with things, it's still intimidating. And people are thinking, oh, I have to become a developer. There's a vast difference between writing automation code and writing system code. You're not dealing with multi-threaded web service, concurrent, JSONified, transactional, blah, blah, insert tech talk
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so you need to learn some fundamentals. And then if you can get code reviews, or even better yet, occasionally pair with a good developer, you learn those concepts of abstraction and don't repeat yourself, and a number of other design patterns that will help your tests be great, without having to worry about kind of that deep algorithm or system level engineering. That's not what you need to grok. That's not what you need to understand. And frankly, that's not where you as a tester are going to bring your value. So it lets you focus on sort of those other things.
Right. You touched on it just a second ago. I don't know that a deep understanding um, of say sort algorithms or anything of that nature is necessarily required. Or a deep understanding of binary search trees. I don't know. I'm just picking random stuff that I've heard of over the years about computer science. I don't know that a deep understanding of that kind of stuff is really necessary to be an effective automation uh, code writer. But you were right. You do need to have, at the very minimum, some fundamentals, and that those um, once you have those fundamentals, you can start to understand that test automation is still going to be code at some level.
Right.
Even if you're using a GUI to manage it, there's going to be code executing based on the steps that you put into your test authoring tool. And I found in my career that even when I had such a thing, it was better to understand and have an understanding of what may be going on behind the scenes with those test steps, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, to that helped me understand better what the test tool was doing, and by extension be able to use it more efficiently.
Right. Right. One thing that actually, I'm going to back up one slide here, back to that backing API, because I just realized one thing that I tend to hammer on a lot, is the notion of test oracles or heuristics, and I am absolutely not the person that invented that. That idea has been around for a long time, but um, again, being with developers, if you write a UI test, for example, that creates something that's going to show up as a row on the on in a grid on the GUI, and you validate that on the UI, it's not enough, right? Because what have we missed? We've missed checking the database, or whatever the persistence layer is.
Right.
It, and I think that complexity of sort of, let me back up here. I'm getting myself dug in. So this is a great example of the difference between being the test developer and a system developer. As a test guy, I still don't know how to hit a web service API or some kind of complex database query to validate that customer record got created. But the developer, that's where they live, right? So they can use that deep system knowledge of doing database queries or building me up an authenticated packet that I can hit a web service endpoint and get a flag back whether or not that record was created down there. I think that again is a great illustration of the developer level knowledge is kind of that infrastructure down, and the tester knowledge is everything above, right? It's that business logic. It's writing a good test, but then being able to ask the developer, dude, I don't know how to hit web services. Help me out here.
Yep. Another common case, for particularly for web applications, my web application has a login page, um, and every test that I do, if I want it to be isolated, that means I've got to log in and do the login procedure every single time.
Right.
Well, is there a way that I can get around that so that I don't have to do it that way? And very frequently there is. There is a way that you can construct your initial browsing to the pages behind the login, um, in such a way that you already have a session created, but
Yeah.
from externally you might not know exactly how to do that. But if you talk to the developers, they can usually point out that, oh yeah, if you just browse to this other URL but you set a cookie in the header request, you'll be okay. Something
Or
along those lines.
absolutely, or even take it a step further. So I'll go back one again. Is that um, working with the developers, you can toggle entire parts of your system's configuration. Maybe you test the login feature, and then you hit a backing API that actually turns off login across the entire system, or does something like gets CAPTCHA out of the way. Uh,
Oh, that's a big one.
it's not just understanding how to work with the system, but for testing, turn stuff off. Make it as easy as possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Turn stuff off for, don't, minimize or simplify the environment as much as possible. Absolutely.
You're
And
saying that
and
much more gently than I would. I'd say make it as painless as possible, or make it suck as little as possible.
well, I mean, I'm thinking about other things, and
Yeah,
this is drifting a little bit far afield from our topic, but things like, very often you have analytics and things like that you don't care about
right.
as a tester in your testing environment, so get rid of them when you're running your automated tests. Um, but yeah, so that's a little bit of a tangent. I digress.
That's okay. We are actually winding up to the end here. Um, so I just want to run back through a couple things here, just to sort of summarize. The specific things that you can do as a tester to get the best chance of having not only just a successful UI automation project, but a valuable one. Talk with the developers, work on testable UI. We gave a couple examples. Think of that test first approach. What can you scaffold out? What conversations can you have early on to help make those tests as easy and as valuable as possible? Leverage the developer knowledge to build up good infrastructure that will help you with configuration and setup and teardown. And learn from the developers what a good section of code looks like. They can help you make sure that your tests are efficient and focused and maintainable as possible. I'd very much like to thank everyone who's attended here. We've had a great turnout. I'd also like to thank Jim for jumping in and having a conversation. That survey report is here's the link for that again. And so we are at the half hour point. But if folks are interested, and Jim, if you've got a few minutes, we can certainly stick around for about 5 extra minutes or so to answer questions. And I'll leave the link up here while we're working through things.
I do
Um,
have a few minutes, so
okay.
I'll stick around.
All right. And I had a number of questions asking whether or not the session would be recorded. Absolutely. We've had it recorded. You'll get a follow-up mail from Telerik after probably next week early, and they'll send a link to the recording where you can get that at. So if you do have some specific questions, feel free to bounce them in the Q&A, and Jim and I will stick around for a couple minutes to ask things here. There's one question here, Jim, that's actually fairly specific. Any thoughts on testability around single-page web applications?
Well, that could almost be a webinar all its own.
It absolutely could.
Um, there's a and coming from a very specific technological perspective, because I can think of a lot of things in the WebDriver world, which is where I spend a lot of time. Some techniques that you can use to fix or to automate those. One of the hardest things there is going to be synchronization,
Yeah,
right? And what to synchronize on, because frequently it is a single page application, so a portion of the page is what's getting updated. Um, and so one of the techniques that I've found pretty useful is to grab something valid on the UI before it's going to be before your operation that's going to refresh the portion of the page. Do the operation and wait for that UI element to then not be valid anymore, right?
right.
And that signals to me then, okay, now I know that the page update has started in such a way, and I can now go and wait for the thing to finish and look for the new thing.
Yep. This is another great opportunity for developers to help out. If you have complex asynchronous things that are going on, the developer can oftentimes add an empty element onto the page that says, okay, you're on the new view. So on a single page application, you're never doing a page load or a reload. You hit the page and then it's all Ajax-ish updates. So you do some actions that change to a new view. You can't figure out the thing to synchronize or latch on. Talk to the developers. Maybe they can set up even an empty div that has an ID on it that you can latch on that.
And it doesn't necessarily even have to be on the UI. Most web automation technologies will let you execute JavaScript in the page that you're looking at, and you could even have them create just a JavaScript variable on the document or on the window object and poll on that as well. That's another approach. It doesn't even have to be a UI element. If I know some designers and some developers get touchy about about the things that go into their UI, so that's another possible approach if that can happen.
It's all a good conversation point because they'll have ideas, you'll have things you need, and you can work from there.
And if I had to point out, if I had to pick one thing, the one most important success factor for test automation, it would be having a good communication relationship with the team that's actually doing the development.
Yeah.
I mean, all the stuff we've been talking about today has boiled down to basically making sure that the lines of communication are open and the communication happens at the appropriate times.
Yeah. Yep. Folks, there are a lot of other questions in the queue that unfortunately we're just not going to have time to get to. But there's one common theme that about 6 or 8 people have asked. Jim, very briefly, where would you point folks that are just getting into automation? What are some of the resources or people you'd point them toward for more information about the things we've been talking about?
Let's see. There are some from. I'm going to come at it from a Selenium standpoint because I know those resources better than generic test resources.
Absolutely, that's fine.
There are a couple of really good books that have come out recently about Selenium test patterns or WebDriver, test patterns and stuff. There's one by a gentleman named Dave Hafner.
Absolutely,
it's really good. He also does a weekly tips mailing list that is also documented on the web at elementalselenium.com that has some great tips for WebDriver tips and tricks.
So, Jim, let me interrupt really quickly. Even though you're talking WebDriver stuff, everybody should be aware that the fundamental things and concepts that Dave and these other folks do in these materials, it might be specific to WebDriver. It's useful for everything. And a big props to Dave Hafner for his content as well. Excuse me for interrupting, but I wanted to make sure that folks understood that's just general goodness, and you can get the concepts out of there.
Yeah, the other one, the other book that I've come across recently that I really like, although in full disclosure, I was asked to write the foreword for it, is Dima Kovalenko's book about design patterns, and I don't know if it actually says best practices in the title. I know you have a, an issue with that particular phrase at times, Jim, but. But that Dima Kovalenko's book is actually quite good as well.
Okay. All right. Folks, I know there's a bunch of questions that are still in the Q&A queue, but we're running a bit long. I tell you what, I will take some time tonight to try to run back through the attendance report and answer some of the other questions. I do want to thank everybody again for attending here. Thanks again as well to Jim Evans for taking some time out of his day for this. I'll throw back up our info there. So with that, I will go ahead and close out the webinar. Thanks for attending. Jim, thanks for your time. And for you
Thank you, Jim. Thank you,
attendees,
everybody.
Look for a follow-up mail from the folks at Telerik, and I'll try to catch up with some of the open Q&As as well. And with that, we'll close out. Have a great day, everybody.